get to be with you again. 2.0 with a little refresh, getting ready to come across this conversation, but please let's keep it conversational. Don't hesitate to pause me or, throw a hand up as we go through the slide deck for conversation. The very first parts, as Lily said, are going to be just refreshing some things we talked about. We will get into some nitty gritty work at the end, and then you will have some coaching time with your coach that you worked with around your aim statement and your driver diagram. Going to lean into Lily or to Stephanie to set those breakout rooms up. And then the individual that you coached with, please go to that coaching room for some assistance. So here we go. I'm going to attempt a good screen share. We'll see how this works out and just get us moving. So today's agenda is basically, like we said, content refresh. We're going to get a quick reminder on that four blocker tool, how to use that really around identifying some tests of change, and then taking those concepts, writing this really strong action plan that's going to talk about your milestones and your measures, of course, the breakouts, and then we'll come back together as a large group to share out and offer some advice. Hopefully, you'll gain some knowledge that you'll want to share with your peers. And then I will turn it back over to Lily for her to take us into what is next. So if you remember our four blocker tool, when we were last together in, I believe it was on the 7th, 2 weeks ago today exactly, when we looked at these, we were setting the stage around the process mapping. And as you complete your process mapping for the process that is tied to your project, this will help you identify areas where you can place potential change, tests of change, meaning that if there is an omission in a process and you're like, oh, if we just did this one thing, it would make this whole process so much better. And or it helps you elevate areas of duplication. So you can omit something. And so as you test or think about what exactly is my process map telling me, you will be able to slot those, whether it's something that's easy to do and offers that high impact, or is this something that may be easy to do but has a low impact? Perhaps it's hard to do and would be a high impact, but it's just not the right timing. So this is a really useful tool to help you think through those. And then this gets us into the actual action. What are we going to be doing? When we think about these PDSA cycles here, we know that we are thinking about what we want to change, and we've identified that through our aim statement, and we've strategized what we could do, what should be removed is also a very powerful test of change. And then we've looked at our data and we kind of know where things sit, or in some of your all's cases, you're championing a new baseline. You're championing something new, and so you don't really have anything to compare it to, but you need to think about what metrics should I be capturing to get the best data, to get the best baseline, so that as this work continues, which I'm hopeful for, that your projects will lead into bigger scopes of work over time, you will know how and why you got to where you are as you move through the process. And once you complete your first test, you're going to know whether that worked great. We're just going to move that forward, or we might should tweak that a little so we make an adaptation, or oh, that didn't work at all, so we're going to abandon. Just wanted a kind reminder that failure is not a problem here. Folks oftentimes think failure is not something that we should be celebrating, but I want to elevate with 5 exclamation points. If you have 5 individuals you're running a test on and it fails and you thought it was going to be a great success, that is something you really should celebrate. You learned it very quickly and you didn't spend a lot of time to learn it. So those are all good things when it comes to this type of work. So here's where we're going to really dig in. This is our kind of meat and potatoes, is what is a test? When we met last, I showed you the slide and we talked a little bit more about what it was not. When you're testing, we're not running a true research project. We're not looking to evaluate. We're not looking to get a new policy approved. In other words, it's not for judgment. A test is done to learn. You're building your knowledge. You're actually, if you think about the quote I gave you, that knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the muscle, If you think of testing as a set of weights in a weight room, you're building muscle. That's what you're really doing. And so as your knowledge, as you run tests and you build your knowledge, then you also are learning how to minimize risk. You have an opportunity to think about what would the next population look like running this test? Is there a way and a means that we maybe should adapt what we're looking at to better serve the needs of that group? So a test really is about learning. That's the point. We just really want to learn. And so sometimes things seem so amazing right out of the gate. And especially when it comes to communication, I shared this with you as well on the 7th. A lot of times when we do a test around communication, we will see huge numbers of improvement. Like I've seen upwards of 80% growth in one test when it comes to communication. And I'm always wanting to hit that pause button on that and remind folks that there's a huge difference between this test worked great and getting it implemented, right? So communication or anything like technology based that we do, it is completely normal to see huge gains right out of the gate because you're doing something that needed to be done and now we have a way to do it. So those are extremely impactful, but they are also going to not show that same dividend all the time because as you move through what should have already been occurring, you're closing up gaps. And so you don't want to just test something one time and go, oh, well, that's beautiful. Let's just move this across the entire institution or across my whole unit or wherever that might sit because you know how it worked on one very specific group. You do not know at this point how this test will impact diverse contexts and diverse populations. And so that is the point in testing on a very small scale and growing towards full scale implementation. So just want to remind everyone to not make that mistake and to skip straight from one test to full implementation of an idea. Okay. Now, plan phase. This is where we kind of start drawing our connections, right? So we have a well-defined aim. It's very clear. We know what we're trying to accomplish. We know what our problem is. We know what two larger works, our primary drivers, we know what we think will drive that change. We have made some sort of a hypothesis. If I do these things, I can expect this outcome. So we kind of have our plan. We just need to think more about how do we put what we envision as a plan into motion. In other words, who's going to do it? When will it be done? How will it be done? And in part of our planning, we have to really think about that baby data. Like your process measures that are going to be part of your plan need to be fit very tightly into your action steps, into what we're actually doing. And so we will get into more of that in just a few minutes. But this plan phase is really the congealing of all the parts that have led you to this place. Like we know what our problem is, we have an idea and we have a hypothesis. So now we've got to get started on writing that plan or our action steps. How are we going to get there? And then, of course, the do plan is we do the thing, right? Whatever that is, and in our time window, right? So we need to make sure, though, that as we start this process of actually doing our test, that we are diligent. I can't say that enough. Be very, very diligent to document your data. Here's what we did. This is the number of students. This is what the immediate response was. We had, and if it's more appropriate, 16 students were part. We lost 2 by this date. We gained 2 by this date. Whatever that data is that sits with your particular plan, you need to make sure that you are collecting it as you documented that you would. Because when we get to the study part, which is our next action window, we need to be thinking about the analysis, right? We need to be thinking about what does this data tell us? And so sometimes when we're looking at the data, it is whatever the outcome was, but did it marry up to what we were expecting? And so that part is, did our hypothesis prove true or was it disproved? And the reason you want to do so much documentation along the way is it will tell you why it was either successful or why it failed. And so when you get to here, having that very nuanced understanding of how you got to your end goal is critical, especially when we get into this act phase. So the last part of this is drawing on that synthesis to know what we actually learned. What did we take away from that test? What did we decide was the positive? Because we always want to be leaning into that positive. Or where did the test fall short? Because that deeper knowledge allows us to decide what's going to be our next step. And if we are to continue this test into the next action cycle, then what would the iteration look like? What would that evolved test look like? What should it look like? So I'm going to stop screen sharing just so we can see each other. And I really want to ask if there's any questions. Does anybody have anything that bubbled up going over that? Okay, not hearing anything. I'll jump us right back in. So just a little nudge to remind you that all improvement requires a change, but not all change is going to be an improvement. And so that helps us get into how do we get to the test? And this is new content. This is the part where we're going to start getting more into writing this action plan. Okay. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's easy because it's really tough. This is probably, in Beth's opinion, this is the hardest part of the process. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, right? There's a lot of reasons why this is hard. When you processed map and you looked at your opportunities and you could identify things that were, glaringly missing, or gosh, we're doing a lot of duplication in this spot, or whatever that elevation was for you around an opportunity, you've got a lot of factors. What's the sequential order that should happen? There were a couple times in coaching I mentioned to some of my individuals I was working with is that really put this up on a wall. Your academic calendar drives so many things. It's also going to drive this testing. Where is your academic calendar? How does that sit? Is the concept, is it a single, meaning that you can do one test and then go from there? Or is this a multiple steps process to get testing done? Does my outcome need multiple tests to know if it will be successful? How does that fit into the calendar? And then there's always that hard part of deciding, well, really, what's the biggest bang for the buck to start with? We want to see a heavy change or a nice change, a good lift in that very first test for a wide variety of reasons. And sometimes we get it and sometimes we don't. But it's such an energy builder. So if you are working on pulling others into your world with this, or you need to work with other departments on your project, or you really want to elevate this to your supervisor or to your dean or whomever that is, having that data and nuanced understanding of how you got this wonderful result will inspire confidence for a little thing we like to call organic spread to happen. People who hear the good work, people who see the good outcomes, it just naturally builds that momentum. And so that organic spread starts with testing and it builds as you build your success. So we're thinking about 90 days, your project. How does that test look for you? What will it be unique to you that is a test but not a commitment for life? And so that's kind of a jumping off part. For each action idea that you come up with, you're going to need an action plan. Now, we're not living in Nick world. This is not a networked improvement community. But if it were, we usually run 3 tests at a time. And you're always like, well, why do you do 3 tests? Well, here's why we do 3 tests. 9 times out of 10, over the course of 4 years, I have learned that one test almost always is kind of joined at the hip to another test, and it's really hard to tease that apart and just do one at a time. So it makes sense to run them simultaneously. It could also be true for you that you find that your first plan that you're wanting to run in your very first piece, your first test, may have kind of like a support piece that needs to be ran at the same time. Sometimes that's communication, sometimes it's technology, sometimes it can be a myriad of things. It can be a whole lot of different things, but you may see that although we're asking you to think about one action plan, you may come back and go, well, that's great, but to get this test to run correctly, I need to do something else. And so That will not be uncommon, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear that. But as we write the action plan, what we need to include are these pieces that you see on the screen. A description of the idea. And there, I believe it's page 103 in your resource, your toolkit that was built by the collaborative has your action plan in there. So you can kind of pull that up and be looking at how that might fit. But you really want to, with clarity, write what your action idea is. Be very succinct, be very clear. What action steps have to be done? Who needs a seat at the table? Can you do it by yourself? Should you be building your support with your other teammates to pull them in to help you? Who are the stakeholders who needs to be made aware of what's going on? You need to know the deadlines. You know, you've got time constraints here, your cycle to be done, 30-day check-in, 60-day check-in, 90-day check-in. Your deadline, the benefit, of course, your performance measures, and you are the owner. I list it with the owner on the bottom because at some point as you continue your work, you may find that this type of improvement, continuous learning, continuous improvement, really does take organic spread, and other units and other people will want to be a part of that. And so as you do action planning with others, it is of paramount importance that you assign a human being to each of your action plans, because you got to hold folks accountable and you got to hold yourself accountable. And so that's who you know to go back to see if the test was really successful. Right. Here's what we were referencing. It's on page 103. You'll have the link if you've not already pulled it up. I can pop it in the chat for you if you want to. Well, I said I could. Nope, I can't. And that's going to get us into types of measures. So, what are they and why are they? And how do you know how to get a measure for a milestone? And of course, it goes back to that strategy around your test, and you've got a 30-day check-in, a 60-day check-in, and a 90-day check-in. When you're thinking about that test and you're thinking about your calendar and your timing and all the pieces that went into selecting that test, your milestone should be, what can I accomplish in that first 30 days? What can I test and know in 30 days if I'm on the right track to achieving my overall goal for this project? Then it's 60 days. What is the next 60-day thing that I need to build on? What was that second push into that? What about the 90 days? And so as you're mapping through this and you're doing your measurements and you're setting things up, you need to make sure that you are looking at what data should be related to each of the steps. And this is what we call a process measure, and we'll break that out just a little bit more in a second. This particular example you're looking at now could be and really should be part of your process map opportunity. So as you're process mapping and you're looking through each of those steps and you're noting what data did you need, I give you an example. This is obviously something that's could be anybody's project, right? We're looking at that handoff between the time when a student applies for admission to the time the student's accepted to the time the student sees an advisor, right? Steps along the pathway, remember, as you process map, each step has its own little post-it note. And we know that admissions is going to connect that student to an advisor via a notification that they've been accepted. And then how soon did it take, how much time passed, in other words, from when the student knew they were accepted to when they actually sit down with an advisor to get a schedule? Some of those questions you can ask yourself. Again, how long did it take? Did the process go exactly as we intended it to go? And how many noticed a week? How many, it should be notices, that's a typo, I apologize. How many notices a week does the advisor receive? So we're trying to measure human capacity there. This is just an example of questions you can ask yourself along your process measure to get some data to put into to your test, to your action plan for your test. So I saw we had something in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing and look at the chat really quickly and answer some questions and take some questions. Oh, Lily's filled us in. Anything question-wise at this point for this part of the process? Okay, process map. We get through the data. We know we're talking about what pieces we need. Let's get into the types to measure them. Okay, and please keep me on time, somebody, because we all know I could talk about this probably for way too long. Okay, here's our type of measures. We really are looking at three types of measures. I will say this balancing measure will most likely not bubble up during your project. I just wanted you to have the knowledge it exists, what it is, why it is. And I also have had a question elevated to me about the expectation that the capstone project must directly impact the AIM metric in order to be considered successful. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, but I want to make sure I get that question answered as well. Your outcome measure is what we're also used to. It's that long, most likely lagging indicator type of measure. You heard me reference it as autopsy data, right? A lot of times we talk about it that way because once you get it, you just know how the patient either lived or didn't survive or whatever the situation was. You don't really know a whole lot more about that. And if it's autopsy data, we just know how they died. We don't know how they lived. But this long-term measure really could be just the next semester, it could be the next 2 years, it could be 3 years. It depends on the type of measure we're doing and the test we're running. But it really gives us no real sense of direction, meaning that great, this is the result we got. It is the process measure that helps us make sense of that. So the process measures are those that are along the way. They're parts, they're the steps, we're making determinations of is this a reliable, because we want to test things to build greater reliability. We want to know that when we come to the end of the test or the end of the process here that we know that we got reliable results. So these process measures really speak to what we did, what we learned, what we needed to learn further, and it helps us make sense of why the outcome measure is what we received what we received because of this, all the data, all those little nuanced pieces. The balancing measure is probably going to be explained further for those who might be interested in the 201. I get really kind of into the nitty-gritty with balancing measures there. But we all know sometimes, depending on our work, that we pull on one part of a problem. We think we have this wonderful outcome that we know we can achieve, but what we sometimes though, sometimes we don't know is if we pull on that cord, on that thread, what does it tangle elsewhere, right? And so a real life example of a balancing measure comes in the form of a test that was run probably last fall, if I thought about it really hard, where this test was around getting students some early communication and getting them enrolled in a priority setting. And what was unknown to the team is that there's actually this map of when certain communications go out and only one certain office can be delivering that communication to keep down, really inundating student inboxes and to keep the response rates and those sort of things up as much as they could. And so, because that was unknown, we kind of tangled one part of a very complex situation. And to mitigate that snafu, if you will, we had to go back and put in a balancing measure. So, balancing measures really are to keep a negative consequence from impacting another group while you're working to achieve something for someone else. And so that's very simplified language there, but basically it is just exactly as it says. If you pull one part and you unbalance the scale, you have to do something to bring that back into alignment. They're the hardest. I would not sit here and tell you any other way. I find balancing measures are often the trickiest to write because a lot of the times when we seek to improve a situation that involves one population of students, it's not uncommon to complicate a process or some sort of a communication that goes to a different group of students. And so you just have to be very mindful that it is a work in progress, and that's another beauty in starting small, right? We're not jumping into this doing a test on 100 students. We're running tests with like 5 students. So it's not something you can't undo very easily. So that's the beauty in this. Now, back to the question. Is the expectation that the capstone project must directly impact the metric in the aim statement in order to be considered successful? That answer is no. You will be successful across your action windows, right? You have little nuggets of data that you can track to know that you're actually moving. But I want to just kind of elevate that if you are doing this project in a short-term setting, instead of a long 2 to 3 year window, and some of you all have opportunity for a 3 to 5 year kind of setup of work that we've talked about, it's that in 90 days, you will not have ran enough tests to really push on that aim statement enough to truly move the needle enough that you can say, oh, this test really moved that needle that way. You would need many more testing and many more opportunities and action cycles to get to the end result that you're seeking for, to know that it is truly driving the aim the right direction. This is building muscle to know that. So please lean into securing your data for each of your action cycles and using that to measure how successful you feel like you are moving. And again, I pause on that because really we're testing for learning. So you really want to be leaning towards the good and consider any movement towards the good as a success, right? So just want to touch base on that. Don't feel like you're going to know for sure that your aim statement is going to achieve all the goals and meet the project, whatever your ultimate percentage of increase is, in 90 days. That does take a little bit more time. It can take a lot of time, or it can take a small amount more time. It depends on what your project is, but lean into your data along the way. This one is, and I have it set this way for a little bit because this is kind of that we're knocking on the door of a more advanced kind of 201 situation with improvement science. There's getting to scale and there's holding the gains. And I mentioned both of these a little bit on the 7th, but I wanted to just briefly take us back to these because again, as you're starting to test and as you're thinking about your timeline and you've got this beautiful process map and you've identified multiple buckets that might be opportunities to get to the eventual aim statement that you want to achieve, you have to think about getting to scale at some point, right? We want to move into a place where we truly become, we take this work and it becomes just how we do business. We want to move from a concept to practice and to then ultimately, hopefully, it becomes policy and standard way of doing business. So getting to scale means 80%. All the students that could, or individuals, depending on your project, that could experience this test actually do experience the test. And we know because we have had to adapt, evolve, make changes along that way, that we know when we get to scale, or that 80%, and we move this to an institutional kind of way of doing work, it will not fail. We know it will be successful. We know we can predict the results it's going to get. Getting to 80% takes time. Remember that little river of discomfort I mentioned, sitting in it, letting the water of time wash you over? That's what you're looking at. This type of work requires a lot of patience and commitment to the process. So that 80% is how we get to scale. Now, holding the gains. Holding the gains is really, it really is the cornerstone of the work. You have this beautiful idea and you've done all these tests and you have really put in the time and the commitment and the work, and you've got the result you wanted, and you've gone to scale, and you take your hand off of it and you move on to the next concept, the next aim, your next goal, whatever, however you want to phrase it, but you don't circle back and keep a pulse check, right? You lose. We call that holding the gains. Holding the gains really comes in run graphs and charts and keeping track of the progress. Are we sustaining? Did we keep the process we put in place? Are we keeping literally a pulse on the heartbeat to make sure that we are keeping that momentum? Because the minute that we don't, it can and frequently does slide back into losing the gains that we had made. So we really want to, as you think about your project, as you think about moving this over the course of time, how do you, as part of that larger getting to scale, how do you put in the data collection infrastructure so that every so often you are nudged to go back, to go and check, to go look at the the data to make sure that what you have worked so diligently to achieve to get to scale stays at scale. We never want to slide back. So that's when I say holding the gains, that's what we're referring to. Oh, I'm going to stop right there because that should get us into our coaching moment. So let's talk about questions. Anything bubble up before we start looking at action plans with coaches? Because that's what we're heading into. As we head into our breakout rooms with your coach, you are going to bring with you your draft if you have one, because I know some of you have already started writing your action plans. Bring those with you, and let's go talk about it. Let's go think about how we can get your action plan written, your timeline, your steps, your measurements, all those good pieces. And then we'll come back together for that large share out and a wrap up. On Lily's group, when you pop right in.
To the very end.
There you
I
go.
was just going to say, if you wanted to catch up again, we could.
Sure. Yes,
I said the
absolutely. Thank
same
you.
thing. Yeah. So usually our communities of practice are about a month apart, and I know we've offered one-to-one conversations and meetings, and Lily, Beth, and I have been having ongoing one-on-one check-ins, but I know folks also really enjoy and find helpful, maybe not all the time, granted, right? But we had some aha moments today as well. So maybe that's something we can think about, Lily, is offering a community of practice before our next one in a month, or, find a way to capture some of the inspiration and all the great stuff we've been chatting about. But should we turn it back over maybe to you, Beth? Do you want to highlight
Sure.
any, themes from your group or any questions for us to share out?
I think one of the biggest themes for me around our conversation today is thinking about how to, when your project is literally laying the foundation, how to like tie baseline data into that and track it across to make sure because you don't have data to compare it to, so you want to build your data and how to build that correctly to stay on focus and stay on track and really excited about that. Excited about the pioneering that's kind of going on with new stuff out there and new tests. So that was really our kind of talk is about we each took turns talking about our projects and what that might look like and action steps and data and building muscle. So
I would say something interesting in our group. We talked about kind of also the noble goal of institutional efficiencies and how sometimes, we're working on process improvement um, because it will, enhance the capacity of our team to be able to serve more individuals or to help a student get an answer or move on to the next step sooner or quicker. We also could be enhancing our institutional metrics through efficiencies, which will, improve maybe some performance funding metrics. So there's a lot of um, I think, ways to frame some of the projects just depending on the work that you're doing, because some of them have very clear student-facing outcomes and direct student leading indicators, and some of them are more institutional efficiency. And I think that that is also, a very worthwhile effort within our projects here.
And anybody from our group want to share out some thoughts? Oh, Anita's going for it.
I will share briefly that I had an aha moment. So the light bulb might have come on. I'm gonna try to keep it on.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think this was unplanned, but we also got talking a little bit about these balancing factors, Beth, that you were chatting about. And I know it's worth having like you said, a whole separate conversation about it, maybe is even more of a 201 concept, but more specifically, when we were looking at a smaller cohort of students we might want to engage with for a test of change, right? Starting with the 5, not scaling something before we understand more intimately what its implications and effects might be, but also with looking at some of our faculty champions, maybe staff champions, and thinking about differences in incentives that we might try using, right? What happens when, those incentives maybe work too well, right? And you set maybe a new precedent, or they make other people feel excluded, or you then redirect maybe a larger population of the student towards a certain, solution or area because something's working really well. And then again, you're contending with how that changes this system, right? And we're not looking at, I know, big scale systems redesign, but it brought up again this concept of balancing factors and just being mindful of how our work may be impacting some of our other colleagues who are not yet part of the leadership exchange, and how we be good stewards of these tools, and not bite off, I think, more than we can chew. So, yeah, interesting conversations.
Well, I'll just kind of go into wrap-up mode if nobody has anything else. I want to thank you so much, Beth, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, and also providing so much supportive coaching to participants. And we are, all three of us, me, Stephanie, and Beth, are all available to any of you. So don't hesitate to reach out and just set up a 30 minutes check-in to touch base. If you just want to like run your ideas by and be like, okay, good, green light, let's go. Happy to be a thought partner with you in any way. Okay, so just what's coming next? We have one more content session, and that is going to be on February 11th at 2 o'clock virtually with Dana Jackson. And Dana is out of Louisville, but does a lot of national consulting and work, especially with the Strive Network out of Cincinnati. And they kind of do cradle to career collaboration and systems change and collective impact type things. And she'll be talking about adaptive leadership. And so what I took away most from her session last year was like best laid plans, right? And so sometimes things do not always go as we hope they will. Sometimes we encounter roadblocks, obstacles, naysayers, folks that are just not drinking the Kool-Aid that we're pouring out, and we all are doing really important work, but sometimes change is hard. And sometimes it's hard to kind of build that coalition of champions as you are also trying to do the work. But, it does take time. And I have always seen that when you prove yourself with small tests of change, those early adopters are going to be the ones that benefit, of course, and then you will be able to win over the rest of your stakeholders as well. Most positive times that's the case. So Dana has been through all sorts of amazing change initiatives and can really talk about some strategies, some tools, some approaches to adaptive leadership to still move forward, even if you may do a little zigzag to get there where you're going. We aren't going to have like a follow-up from that session. That is just going to be a content session. And hopefully it's well timed, and hopefully just as you're kind of getting into some of the implementation pieces of your tests, you'll have some strategies in your back pocket in case you hit a roadblock. We will have a 30, a 60, and a 90-day check-in, which is going to be all group. And so we can kind of hear, how are things going? Are you facing any challenges? Do we need to pivot? If maybe we started off a little bit with a large scale project, and now we're kind of realizing that timetables and partnership energy is not where we need it to be. What does it look like to adapt to that? And so I think our community can really help each other as we think about any adaptations that we may make as we move forward. The only other thing I wanted to say in prep for just thinking down the road to that May 14th and 15th capstone presentation. So excited to see what happens over the next few months. Just be thinking about the process wheel, and in your toolkits, it's one of the early pages in there, because that's the holistic process. And I know that now we're into the test of change, and so we're really moving forward. But when you are sharing out your project in its entirety, please touch on those different aspects of the process wheel so we can see who is in your ecosystem. You know, how did you build relationships and trust with these partners to agree on a common goal and then an approach to moving forward? You know, tell me about your current state picture, whether that's mostly the baseline data that you walked in with, or it's through the journey and the process mapping that you did during the project. Where is your student voice? You know, I'm really interested and we'll be listening for how are we centering the student in our projects. And then, of course, we get into the actual improvement science and the test of change and the stuff that I know we're all excited. The doing, we're finally here at the doing part of the wheel. And so good job, you know, if you have marched with your partners through this process and now you're ready to go, hopefully you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of common ground, and people are on the same page. And I really feel like there's a what's in it for them as they continue to invest in this work. All right, well, those were kind of closing thoughts. You know, don't forget our capstones will be you know, you'll get feedback or thoughts on your capstone from a wonderful panel of judges. We'll have Dr. Thompson, of course. We will have Blythe Pickett from the James Graham Brown Foundation, who actually funds the Leadership Exchange program. And we'll also have Paul Markham, who is kind of a national partner in higher education work through the SOBA organization that partners with the collaborative. And they will be awarding grants to our top 2 capstones showing early impact. Leading indicators, process indicators, just tell us that, you know, just we're interested in seeing the momentum and where it's headed. And that's a $15,000 grant and a $10,000 grant. All right, I hope that that is inspirational and helpful as you know, look to the next steps beyond the project. But anything else? Any final thoughts or questions? Okay, exciting stuff. Well, we'll update the impact exchange, and just don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
You.